Is it time to start? Yeah, we're ready. Okay. So Friday night I had the opportunity to speak to a lot of you ladies look familiar from there, and that was a huge blessing for me. And I had shared with you what I said was part one of this aspect of my testimony. I told you that I had been raised in a Christian family, grown up at church, probably like a lot of you, went to youth group and Sunday school in Awana, and I had this beautiful image of my mom, who to this day would be doing the same thing this morning if you were with her. She, every morning I would wake up, I would come downstairs, and she would be reading her Bible, she would be praying, she would be having her cup of coffee, and no matter how old I was or how young, that's what I woke up to every single morning. And so I knew that to be the person that God wanted me to be, I needed to have that kind of relationship with him that she had, because she was and is such a godly woman. That impression left me setting my alarm every morning, waking up, reading the Word for a few minutes, falling asleep, scrambling through the rest of my day, because although I knew it was what I should do and the goals were ultimately what I wanted, I just hadn't prioritized a relationship with God as the thing that is most important in my life. I would still stay up late and do things with friends and watch movies and all those things I wanted to do. And I did want to spend time with the Lord, but because I was trying to do too many things and not leave enough time for rest, then I started having children, then I was up in the middle of the night with children, that God just sort of took this back seat. And I shared how 13 years ago when I was pregnant with Tristan, our third child, through a series of trials and difficult times, God had brought me to a place where I began to prioritize that. I began to set that alarm no matter how tired I was. Had a 3-year-old and a 1.5-year-old and a newborn baby, and we were moving and all kinds of things were going on, but through everything I had been through, I got up every morning and I would spend probably an hour in the Word studying and just getting to know God in a new way for the first time. And there was no amount of stress or busyness, no lack of sleep that would ever have gotten in the way of me spending that time with him. It just meant that much to me. So I wanted to share today, I was saying that it seems obvious that when someone commits themselves to God's Word, they would commit themselves to prayer as well. But for me, those were two very different things, and they didn't come together for me right away. It wasn't for 5 more years after I began being in the Word daily that I began to communicate with the Lord on a daily basis as well. The reason for this is because reading the Bible made perfect sense to me. God created us, he saved us, and he gave us his Word. And his Word was the means by which we could know him and the means by which we could become wise. And so reading it was obvious. But praying eluded me. I couldn't understand the purpose of prayer. And I wanted to read just a few verses from Psalm 139. It says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You have known when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thought from afar. You scrutinize my path and my lying down, and are intimately acquainted with all my ways. Even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all." Now, David wrote these words as something that asking God to look at his life, but also as a comfort that God would know us so closely and all the little small details of our hearts, of our words, of our deeds, of our life. But a passage like that, I looked at it differently. I thought, why would I pray? God already knows everything I'm going to say, do, everything I'm thinking. He knows every motivation of my heart better than I even know my own self. And so prayer for me seemed like I would be boring God with information he was already aware of. Unless, of course, I was in a crisis, then I pray like crazy, like all of us do. But that's not really a relationship with God. I left off in this portion of my testimony with the birth of Tristan and coming to a place where God was first in my life, or his Word was first in my life. After Tristan was born, I got pregnant again, and I had Shane less than 2 years later. He's 11 now. And this, another facet of my testimony, which I won't get into for time's sake, but God had brought me to a place after the birth of Shane where I was so ready to relinquish the control that I desired over my family size and how many and how close together and all those things. Steve and I hadn't used birth control for a long time, but I had still struggled with the decision. I had committed to it, but it wasn't something that I had peace about. After the birth of Shane, I was wholeheartedly ready to have 10 kids if that's what God wanted. I had finally, 7 years, gotten to a place of peace. We bought a 15-passenger van in anticipation that was going to be our story. And we drove it home from California thinking we were going to fill it up with kids. And I thought that the place of peace that I had finally come to, finally relinquished that idea of control, was the beginning of this story of having a kid every 18 months and just seeing how much God would bless us with that. And at the very time when I thought I understood where God was going, he decided to completely shift gears. And thank you, he was glad that I learned the lesson that I learned, but now a whole new lesson was awaiting me that I had no idea. So after Shane, I got pregnant again, of course, right away. And 3 months into that pregnancy, I had a miscarriage. I had 2 miscarriages before Ian, our oldest. He's 16 now. And so it wasn't like I'd never had one, but I had 4 kids in a row, really, no problem. Everything was fine. And so it was my full expectation that this child would be number 5 and followed by number 6 and so forth. So it was pretty shocking. But over the years, God had really taught me about trusting his sovereignty, that he was in control and he had a plan. And whether or not I understood it, it was his and I could walk in it. And so I did. We grieved that loss, but immediately we were pregnant again. And 3 months later, we miscarried again. This is a difficult time because I was so certain I knew the direction God wanted us to go. After all, it had been such a long time getting me to the place of trusting him in this area, and now we've got miscarriage upon miscarriage. And so people were wondering if maybe we should take these as signs, that maybe we should be happy with the 4 we have and be done. And we were always open to these things. We would pray about all these things, but we just didn't have any peace about it. And right after that, I got pregnant again. This is pregnancy number 9 now. And so we had decided, let's keep this pregnancy as quiet as you can keep it. But if you've been pregnant 9 times, your body doesn't keep things very quiet to people who see you every day. But we didn't make any major announcements. And we decided, let's wait until 16 weeks. That's definitely the safety point where everything's going to be okay at that point. So we did. And we got to 16 weeks, and we greatly rejoiced because we had gotten past that 14-week point. It had been our struggle area with children, with pregnancies. And we told everybody we knew. And at 20 weeks, we got to go in for our big sonogram, took our 4 kids with us. We had 3 sons and a daughter at that point, and all of them wanted a little sister so badly. And they prayed earnestly that would be God's will. And we went into that room. We were blessed with the news that we were, in fact, going to have a little girl. And so we were so excited to add a second daughter to our family. We told all of our family in California, our home church in California, and all of our friends in Washington, and everybody was rejoicing with us. Time went on in the pregnancy, and things were going fine and normally. I began to feel her move and kick as any other baby. We drove to California every summer to visit my parents and my siblings, and we decided to push our trip back to May instead of our usual trip in July. So we went, and it was very busy. It's always very busy. And this baby had been very quiet. I mean, she kicked and moved, but she was not as noticeable as my other children had been when she was inside of me. And so it was easy to kind of forget about her in the hecticness of having 4 kids, ages 5 and under. And so it was the very last day of our trip. 3 weeks we'd been there. It was a Sunday morning. And I woke up with the thought, when was the last time I felt her move? And I really couldn't remember. I wasn't super worried because that didn't mean she hadn't. I just couldn't remember. And so I purposed that day that even though we had a really full day ahead of us, I was going to make special note of how many times she kicked that day, how many times I felt her. After a long day, and by 8:30 that night, I knew that I had not felt her at all the entire day. So I was starting to feel a little bit nervous about that, and my mom took me to the emergency room. They felt around, with their machines for a heartbeat for a long time. It felt like a long time, probably wasn't that long. Finally, they said, oh, there it is, there's that heartbeat. I was really conflicted with this news because my brain side of me said, you're finding this heartbeat so low on my stomach. In what conceivable position could this baby be in where this could be her heartbeat? I just couldn't fathom how that could be true. But that emotional side of me was just like, thank God, she's okay. And there's my mom sitting in the chair across from me. She starts crying as soon as they say that they found a heartbeat. And so that won over, and I was just like, okay, she's great. I'm not going to worry about her anymore. She's going to be fine. She's going to probably be a nice, mellow baby, and that'll be awesome too. And so we drove home the next day. And when we got home, several days went by, and I already had a 6-month doctor visit scheduled. I was about 28 weeks along. And I went to my visit, and the same thing happened, only this time he didn't have the heart monitor so low, and he had him in natural positions. And he's like, I'm sorry I can't find a heartbeat, but don't despair. Go to the sonogram room, downstairs, and they'll give you a really thorough exam. So I go into the very same room where just a few months before, Steve and I and our 4 kids had all rejoiced at the news that we were going to have another daughter. And I laid there, and she told me in all sorts of medical terms that this little girl had died, and that she had probably died as much as 2 weeks before based on her size. And I wasn't shocked, I suppose, but obviously I was incredibly sad. And the hardest part for me was knowing I was going to have to go home and tell the kids, and especially Michaela, that she wasn't going to have that sister, or they weren't going to have that sister. And God's answer to their prayer was no, not this time, or maybe not at all. Well, you can see I have 1 daughter and 5 sons, so it was not to be. A couple days later, when you miscarry at 28 weeks, you don't have a D&C or a natural miscarriage like you would earlier on, which I'd had before. You have to actually go into the hospital, be induced, have an epidural, go through labor, all those things. They assign just 1 nurse to you who attends to you the entire day. And so I went through that process and delivered her, and they whisked her away, washed her up, dressed her, took pictures of her, brought her back to me and put her in my arms. And of course she was gone. Her soul was with the Lord, but she still had those features of our family, and there was such resemblance of life still in her. And I held her and talked to her and told her all the things I wish that I could have told her. As you kind of go through this process of saying goodbye, and finally I felt it was time to press that nurse's button, that call button, and she came in wheeling that little cart bed. And before I'd even gone into the hospital, I had thought through what the process would be like, and I knew that the most difficult moment would be putting that baby down on that cart and watching that nurse walk away. Because even though she was gone, I was never, ever going to be able to touch her or hold her again in my life. And so she came, and it was so surreal, like everything was happening in slow motion, and felt like so slowly I was laying her down, and it was such a difficult thing to just release my hands. But I took my hands off of her, finally, and they took her away. And of course I cried, but it's time to go home, and going home was hard, sad, and yet it just filled us both with such a sense of gratitude for the 4 kids that we had. We just hugged them extra tight and loved them, even more so that we had them and they were ours and they were okay. After she died, there's a sort of a time between that and the funeral as they tried to understand why. They tested Steve and I for every conceivable problem, her as well, and as I knew, as I was certain, everything came back normal. There was absolutely no medical reason why she should have died. There was absolutely nothing wrong with either of us. But I had this sense of that God was doing something in our lives, and this was just the route that he was going to go. 2 days after that, I went back for my post-visit. The doctor said I was fine. We'd left our kids with a close friend. We had gone over to the mall just briefly to run an errand, and I was coming down the escalator. And all of a sudden, I was totally overwhelmed with this horrible feeling. It wasn't like I was sick, but it was bad. and I didn't know what it was. I'd never felt that way in my life. And I just looked at Steve and I said, I don't know what's wrong, but I just need to go home right now. And so we did. We left the mall, we grabbed our kids, and we went home. Looking back and understanding what I understand now, I know that, women suffer postpartum after a 9-month-old baby, but when your body has to be forced to give up something 3 months before it's ready, it really throws your body out of whack, and some crazy things can go on. And that's what was happening, but I didn't understand that. I started thinking things that I'd never thought in my life. I started crying all the time. I would leave the dinner table and go to bed and cry. I hate lying in bed and I don't like crying. And I'm not a sad person, and I was just constantly like that. I couldn't enjoy things, and I was beginning to be really afraid that this was who I was going to be. I was so scared. And probably about the 10th day of going through this, I was talking to Steve, and he's trying to help me, but he hasn't struggled with this either, and so he doesn't really know quite what to say. And he said to me, call my mom. She's dealt with this her whole life. She'll probably know what to say. And his mom's this really godly woman. She's a pastor's wife as well. And so I called her late one night, and I told her where I was at and the kinds of things that were going through my mind and how scared I was. And she shared some passages from 2 Corinthians 1, especially with me. But then she said to me, Les, listen, you think you're so strong. You think you're so tough. You think you can do everything yourself. And she was right. See, I grew up in a really athletic family, and my parents, especially my dad, not my mom so much, would always say things to us like, suck it up, and there's no crying in sports, and, be tough, and all that kind of stuff. And so it was like a weakness to rely on other people or to ask other people or anything like that. And so we did grow up very self-sufficient and thinking we were very capable within ourselves. And she knew this. Steve and I have been married for a while now at this point. And she said, God didn't just create you and then send his son so that you could know salvation through the message of the gospel. God created you and saved you for the sake of a relationship with him. Now, I'd already been reading his word for 5 years now, every day, very, very diligently, and I was, I wasn't going to give that up. It meant way too much to me. But there was this aspect of a relationship with God which I lacked. And like I shared in the beginning, because I couldn't rationally understand why prayer would ever matter, I just wouldn't do it. I just didn't. I thought I'd be boring God, and I thought I would be redundant. And why would God even care about that stuff? He already knows it anyways. I didn't realize that just like a human relationship, when you don't communicate, there's something missing. You guys all know that, whether it's husband and wives or parent-children or family members or whatever, communication is a part of relationships, and it's a part of our relationship with God. It enriches us, the believer. So throwing aside all this false logic that I thought I'd relied on, I woke up that next morning. For one thing, I immediately sensed that whatever that sort of darkness I felt on me was gone, was just lifted. But I got up. We have this big empty living room because it's where we have church. And when we don't have it all set up for church, all the chairs are stacked against the walls, and there's just this big open space. It's kind of a funny looking room. And I just started walking around it. And I just started saying, well, God, it's me. I'm not really sure why I'm here, but my mother-in-law says I should talk to you, and well, I know you already know what I'm going to say. You knew I was going to say that too, but I'm still going to try this. And you can imagine me fumbling through my first real attempt at prayer. But I was committed because I knew God had brought me to this place through everything that I had gone through. And I knew that this is why, and this was what he wanted for me to learn through this. And so the next day I did the same, and the next and the next. And I remember waking up one morning, and it was 3 weeks after I had started praying on a daily basis. And I was praying, and in the middle of my prayers, I stopped. And I thought to myself, just 3 weeks. And I thought to myself, how did I ever go even one single day of my life without this? To me, in such a short period of time, if you had asked me, what does one need to survive? Food, water, oxygen, the Word of God, and prayer. It was as essential to me for living as any kind of physical thing that our body needs to sustain life. And in that short period of time, my relationship with God had, gone from just a relationship with his word, and I was growing, of course, to this communion with God, and it deepened my walk with him, and it enabled me to know him better, and it gave me a place also to share myself. And one of the beautiful things that came out of this was in my relationship with Steve, really. Steve is super introverted, and I'm pretty extroverted, and so I'm someone who likes to talk. And especially when we were first married, whatever thought came into my head, I would say it to him. This probably drove him crazy. And he was so quiet, I would always constantly be saying, "What's the matter? What's the matter? Are you mad? Are you mad at me? I'm sorry. I don't know why, but you must be mad because you're quiet." But over this time of developing this relationship with the Lord, even my relationship with Steve, which I talked about Friday, had changed already, began to change as well. And instead of going to Steve with everything, troubles, joys, all the struggles, anxieties, all those things of life, God was my go-to now. I talked to him first. I burdened him, and I shared with him, and I cried to him, and I went to him. And on occasion, I went to Steve too, and he would always bring me back to the Word, and that's why I could go to him. But God became the one I went to first, foremost, most throughout the day, not just in the morning, but all the time. I hate to use the term best friend, but he became the one I spoke to and shared with more than any human. And so, to conclude my story of my children, since they play such a big role in this part of my testimony, we had another miscarriage after her, believe it or not, and we got pregnant again. And I said, "God, I can't keep doing this. I trust you. I want to do whatever you're wanting me to do, but I just can't keep getting pregnant and being pregnant for 3 months and miscarrying. I just can't keep doing this over and over again. I'm so exhausted, and I don't know how long I can keep this up." And I said, "Lord, if this pregnancy ends in miscarriage, I just don't think I can do this anymore." I went to the doctor. I was 10 weeks along. The doctor said, "Okay, I know we've tested everything. I know we've done everything. I know there's no answers, but here's that one thing I think. All of your kids have gotten smaller with every birth, 9 pounds, 6, 5, a smaller 5-pounder. I think, though I can't prove it, that there's something with thickness in your blood, and I want you to give yourself a shot of blood thinners every single day in your stomach for this pregnancy. If it doesn't work, I've got nothing, we've got nothing." It's like, okay. He goes, "Go to that sonogram room," same one. "Make sure your pregnancy is still, going strong. Make sure your baby's alive. If so, let's do these shots." I was like, all right. I went to that room again, and she was really quiet, eerily quiet, and I didn't know what she was going to say. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you know you're having twins?" I was like, what? It was this initial moment of shock, of course, but then there was this just joy, and then I said, "Of course I'm having twins, because one would be too easy. I've already got 4. I know what to do with one, but God wants to grow me, so I'm going to have 2 at the same time. We're going to see how that goes." And so I gave myself a shot every day. I was only able to carry them 7 months. It was an emergency delivery. They couldn't stop my labor, and they really, thought it was probably a good idea if I didn't have any more after that. But Rory and Aiden are going to be 7 next Sunday. And God double blessed us at the end of this journey. But the greatest gift, as great as our children are and our relationships are, is that God loved me enough to take me from that church-going girl who knew the right thing to do to somebody who had a deep, daily relationship with the Lord through his word and through prayer.